This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. We have another installment of Hollywood Hates History. This is a collaboration with Scott Rank of the History Unplugged podcast and others on the very best and, of course, the very worst history-based movies. Let's see if Hollywood hates history today. Every so often, Hollywood gets a movie based on a historical event and a piece of literature just absolutely perfect. The producers really get the tone and the big ideas of a novel and the historical events and context and background the novel depicted. It's a tough job and a tough balance to make a novel into a movie. I really wish we had a movie like that to talk about in this episode, but we 100% do not. The Scarlet Letter from 1995 stars Demi Moore and Gary Oldman and tries to bring the seminal American novel The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne to the silver screen. Let's see if Hollywood hates history. If you have a historical movie you love or hate, let me know and maybe we can make it into an episode for Hollywood Hates History. I have a few other movies in the works with Scott Rank and other podcasters. If you'd like to participate in Hollywood Hates History, send me an email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com and we can try and work something out. Thank you again for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast, and I will see you next time Beyond the Big Screen. Welcome back to another exciting edition of where Scott and I talk about movies, historical movies that we love and we hate. Today we have a real gem, The Scarlet Letter from 1995, starring Demi Moore as Hester Prynne, and Gary Oldman as Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, Robert Duvall as Roger Prynne, and a cast of others who were well known, at least in their time in the 80s and their 90s. This movie is available for rent on most of your streaming services. Even if you want a few laughs, there's several very good clips of it on YouTube if you don't want to completely torture yourself for 90 minutes. Now, just a very brief... Well, Scott, before we even get started, you watched the movie. What was your overall take of it? Because you're going to have to defend this movie.
Yeah, this is going to be some really creative interpretation for me to say how it's awesome. Wow. I'm kind of torn. Before this episode, we talked about John Wayne as Genghis Khan. Is Demi Moore worse casting as a Puritan who's, struggling with trying to remain an upright life in Puritan New England? Is she a worse casted person as Hester Prynne? What do you think?
That's probably one of the most difficult questions I've been asked in a long time. John Wayne as Genghis Khan was just extraordinarily bad, and I would say that she very much gives him a run for his money, because Demi Moore as Hester Prynne is really bad casting. People should be fired, careers ruined over that one.
Yeah, it's a classic thing of a terrible English accent. It's sort of like Keanu Reeves and Bram Stoker's Dracula, just horrible. I'm trying to think of this movie's for. I mean, for an 11-year-old who's hoping for Demi Moore body shots in 1995, or like a pubescent boy, which is probably a demographic for this movie, you're probably watching the edited made-for-TV version, so it doesn't work in that sense. The sensual shots we see at first are of Gary Oldman, so I guess that's progressive gender politics for whatever it's worth. Yeah, and it's a waste. I mean, you have Gary Oldman, who's awesome, but I think of him as Chief Commissioner Gordon, not this, sensual firebrand, but this is the 90s. Robert Duvall's in it, so it had a lot going for it. I don't know. I guess I'll talk about the positive later, where it's kind of like The Conqueror with John Wayne's Genghis Khan. I see ways where it theoretically could have worked and didn't work, And I have some compliments on some very, very tertiary elements of this movie where it could have been worse, but it wasn't worse. So that's where I'm going to go for it. Yeah, let's do it. This is, brace yourself.
I guess I'll start quickly with just some of the kind of the outside context of how the movie sits. The movie was from the mid-90s, 1995, and this was what I call peak Demi Moore, really. She had a lot of really big movies, but she was just on the other side of the hill on the decline, because she would make this movie and then there was a couple of other stinkers after that, and then she had gone on a probably a several year drought where she didn't even make any movies, and it was right after this time. Demi Moore had a lot of clout and helped to guide the direction this movie went in. So that gives you, and when we'll talk a little bit later about some of what her philosophies were on the movie and the historical context. Another aspect of the context of this movie is that it was based on the 1850 novel of Nathaniel Hawthorne of the same name, The Scarlet Letter. I'll give the movie some credit in the very broad strokes. It did follow the very, very skeleton outline of the movie. I mean, it had the same characters, they had the same names, happened in more or less the same place, the same time, and the narrative hit most of the key spots of the novel. But that's about it. They have
the same names, so
they
there you go.
Yeah.
They did get
And after that, that's about it. Now, I'll give you a quick summary of the movie. This won't take too long because there's not a lot there. Basically, Hester Prynne, the movie starts off with her landing, probably somewhere like Plymouth Rock or something like that. She gets off of the boat and she's wearing like all this fashionable garments, and you're in your mind that she's coming into the Puritans with their like belt buckle hats and all that. So she's made a real splash, like the first scene. And obviously the townfolk think that this beautiful, independent, outspoken, intelligent Hester Prynne scandalous. I mean, they're Puritans, for crying out loud. All the good wives are jealous, and the good Puritan menfolk are judgmental but secretly want to be with her. It's hitting all those classic themes right there that they wanted to hit in a 1990s film. And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
I was trying to think what movie are they ripping off that where I thought, well, it's not Footloose with Kevin Bacon where a guy comes to like a boring small town and shakes it up with the power of dance.
And there's a little bit of that.
So I'm trying to figure out like what is this trope that they're getting on that doesn't make any sense with this movie, but yeah,
something
it's already
something of that effect, that she's coming to these people who are tight-laced. I mean, that was a really common, that would happen a lot of the movies in the 80s that she probably even starred in. Now,
yeah, it's true. It's like a Brat Pack thing, except in like 1650s Plymouth Colony.
Exactly. Now, Hester Prynne is sent to the Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts Bay Colony, to get her family set up. Her husband, Roger Prynne, has sent her ahead to buy a house and get their life set up. Now, for some reason, Hester finds a nice house out in the woods, not inside of the palisade where you might be protected when you're living in the wild frontier. But anyways, so what's the first thing that she sees is she peeks through the brush and sees a guy going for a skinny dip. One thing leads to another, and Hester Prynne and her new beau know each other in the biblical sense, if you will, Puritan style. I mean, and that is one of the cheesiest scenes in all of movie history, where they're like romping around in this grain silo. Like you said, it was probably titillating for the for the 11-year-olds, the 11 to 15-year-old demographic.
Yeah, I'm from Iowa. There's nothing more sensual than rolling around in a grain bin. For listeners, please, Steve pointed me to the Roger Ebert review, and he talks about how it's there's Tituba, her mute servant, is seeing a red bird fly around in her bathtub as, symbolizing sin.
Oh, it's brutal.
It almost makes you wonder, is there also going to be a love that dare not speak its name of an interracial lesbian romance in Plymouth Colony?
Yeah.
The movie doesn't go in that direction, but it wants to.
Yeah.
So read Robert Eder. Like, he just says it's so awkward with the soft focus lighting sensuality in of getting it on Puritan style.
And just to add to that, this film does not age well. Like, it looks every bit of 1995, like just the worst of 1995. And it probably even looked like that in 1995. Just so, I don't know, we both said this, we don't know, we're not film geeks as such on how they're filmed, but they must have had like a bad technology at that point where it just does not come across well. Now, to move forward a little bit, the person that Hester Prynne goes for this little romp with is the Reverend Mr. Arthur Dimmesdale, who's the really highly esteemed and beloved parson, pastor of the colony, the Puritan colony. Now, Hester winds up getting pregnant from this tryst, and with no husband around, the people of the town draw the natural inference, and everybody's up in arms. Hester is publicly humiliated and has to wear an uppercase letter A on her jacket, which symbolizes her adultery or adulteriness, that she's obviously been in some sort of affair that she shouldn't have been in. She won't say who she was in the affair with, so there's obviously all the standard gossip going around. Now, while she's getting humiliated, in the back of the crowd, she sees that her husband, Roger Prynne, who she had heard at some point was supposed to be dead in a shipwreck, she sees him out in the crowd. And it winds up that Roger had been living with these Native Americans, and he went so nuts when he was there, the Native Americans kicked him out of their village.
So I guess that's complimentary to Native American tribal life in a nice sort of way. I don't know.
They wouldn't put up with a lunatic Robert Duvall in their village, and I don't blame them for that. To make a long story short, Hester has the baby while she's in prison. Roger Prynne, her actual husband, he really tries to put the screws on her to tell her who she had her affair with, and he's like full-blown psycho at this point. She doesn't want to blow up Arthur Dimmesdale's life because, she loves him and stuff, I suppose, even though they haven't developed that. And she knows that Roger Prynne's is total crazy town, and that he's going to kill Dimmesdale and, just go psycho on everybody. During all this time, we cut to the chase. Roger Prynne / he also goes by Roger Chillingworth. He takes on an alternate identity. He makes this plan to start a conflict between the Algonquin Indians who live outside of Boston and the Pilgrims. He goes and scalps some of the townspeople, the Puritans, to make it look like the Algonquins did it. The Puritans attack the Algonquins, and then the Algonquins in the ultimate scene come and attack the town with fire arrows, and I think they set a cart on fire and threw that through the town. Which that almost sounds like
the
something.
Fire arrows, yes.
Sounds like something the Mongols would do. There's the big fight, and lots of people are dead. Roger Prynne feels so guilty, he kills himself. And all in all, in the end, the leaders of the colony don't want any of this mess getting back to England, basically like back to corporate headquarters. So they're going to smooth it all over and pretend like none of this happened. And they're going to let Arthur Dimmesdale rather, and Hester Prynne go run off to Carolina colony and live happily ever after. And that's that. Now, what's
perfect.
Wrong with that?
They did it all right.
It's all happily ever after. They get to live in sunny Carolina on the beach, and that's it. And so what might be the problem with that? There's a lot of problems. Scott, since this is your duty, what did you like about this movie?
Okay, so I'm really reaching here, so you're just going to have to bear with me on this. In terms of period appropriate dress, it was somewhat accurate. It wasn't as chintzy as, like a children's production of a First Thanksgiving. So I guess that's something there. Okay. Roger Chillingsworth, who goes off with the Algonquins, who, he goes and he scalps some people. Roger does. I guess it presumes he learned it from the Algonquins or he developed on its own. This is not central at all to the film, and I doubt it was even its intention, but it inadvertently stumbles on the fact that different American Indian tribes had very different cultures. It's highly erroneous to lump them all together. Some were far more warlike than others. Some were much less so. Some, as the American government expands, try to work as complicitly as possible, like the Cherokee, and they get still treated horribly for it. The Algonquins were quite warlike, and they did historically scalp. So that's one thing there. This came to my mind as we were talking about the first sensual scene with Gary Oldman. Really a way to subvert your expectations there when this is being, pitched as a Demi Moore movie. This is something I'm surprised people don't realize. I read a question on Quora. It's this site where people submit questions and you get expert answers. I read it a lot. Someone asked, what did people use for bathing suits before the 1900s? And there was a very long answer where they said, well, they swam naked. That's just what you did. And even if you look in ancient sources, if you see mosaics of fishermen, they're actually working naked because just among same gender, it wasn't thought of that big of a deal. And I think this historical account I read, they mentioned at the end of one of the gospel accounts when Peter and John are fishing, it mentions their nakedness. So this is something, at least, especially in poorer life, when you only wore one set of clothing, would be common. That's, again, like very tangential to the plot. So you see how far I'm having to reach here to see what's good. Let me think if I can think of anything else. Oh, okay. This was it. Now, like you said, the movie starts out ridiculously with Demi Moore scandalizing people with her European fashion, like as if like anyone but royalty would have opulent fashion in the 1630s, and you're definitely not bringing that stuff to Puritan America. No. But what they're trying to do is they're making her a 1995 woman and plunking her in the past. And we talked about the Crusade movie Kingdom of Heaven, and I just ripped this to shred. I hated the movie. Where Orlando Bloom's character is a 21st century man trained to preach interreligious tolerance to people in the Crusades, and it's stupid. What I think is good theoretically about this movie, and again, this is good in theory, not good in execution, is that the original Scarlet Letter novel is also ahistorical in some ways. I mean, if you remember your high school English, there's a lot of themes of transcendentalism in that book, and that was a popular belief system and philosophy at that time from the 1830s to about the 1850s when it was written, where the idea that you can experience and see the divine in nature and corrupting sinful influences can be put upon us socially. And that's a theme where Hester is removed in the forest and around the divinity of nature. But it's this the judgmentalism and hypocrisy of society is what she's up against. So and I don't mind historical fiction that addresses 21st century issues. I mean, I don't want all historical fiction to be like a Discovery Channel documentary or an academic thesis, by no means. And great works of historical fiction can address common concerns while still being faithful to what characters of that time would have experienced. A good example is The Crucible, the Arthur Miller play set during the Salem witch trials, and it was an allegory for communism and the Red Scare and McCarthyism. So it addresses contemporary concerns, but it does so by pointing at universal issues of paranoia and crowd psychology and moral panic and overcoming these things. But it manages to address these universal themes with Puritan characters that are faithful to what people like that would have been. So theoretically, this movie could have done the same by addressing themes of 1995. I don't even, what was the point of this movie, Steve? What was the theme? I'm trying to figure out what it was trying to say. Can you?
I think that it inversed the themes of the novel. In the novel, the theme is guilt and sin and how people dealt with that in a confined society, where in the movie, it's really saying, it's a 1995 message of, I'm a woman and I'm a man and we're going to be together no matter what society says. And, then we're going to flip society on its head and then run away. That's the theme that that's the only theme that I'm able to pull out of it, is really it's an individualistic theme, where the novel is really showing how people had to basically suck it up and deal with making mistakes, and how they individually dealt with those in really a closed society.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, where like the type of radical individualism, the way they do it in the movie, and I think, isn't Hester about to be hanged when she's pregnant?
Yeah, I think,
which just like would not happen in a trillion years. Like, you would, except for murder, you wouldn't hang a woman. I mean, if she were indicted for witchcraft, that's one thing, but America was built on shotgun weddings and people who got knocked up and then went to another town. My grandfather, rest in peace, is part of that story, and my grandmother too. So America's built on that. You just, go out into the woods or go to a next town, and it's not as quite that big of a deal. I mean, that's Nathaniel Hawthorne is doing that for dramatic element, but when she has the child, she's merely just ostracized from society.
Yeah.
And it's informal ostracization, which up into the early to mid 20th century, the same thing in the United States, where if you were a female who got pregnant in high school, so to say, you would, quote unquote, go stay with your grandmother for a while. And the townspeople might know what that meant, but they wouldn't say anything out of politeness. And then you would return and give a child up for adoption. If you were to openly flaunt your pregnancy out of wedlock, then you would be informally ostracized from society. But in Puritan colonies, by no means, you wouldn't be hung by any means. So to have kind of like the grand speech about how we're going to subvert this social order, it doesn't work at all. It's whatever it's trying to say. It adds to the mountain of silliness that is this movie.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. And in the end, I really think that the thread that connects all these movies that we've talked about that we hate is that they're really trying to tell a story of the time the film's being made, be it in 2001 and the War on Terror with Kingdom of Heaven, or 1995 with this movie. Another thing with this movie was I remember in 1995 living up in New York, and in this New York, New England area, everybody was moving to North Carolina in the 1990s. You'd probably have like 2 uncles and an aunt who had moved down there, and half your friends moved down there. So it was kind of like a boogeyman that your entire neighborhood was going to clear out and move to some place in North Carolina you'd never heard of. And I honestly think that that's where they came up with that they were moving to Carolina, the Carolinas, to start over again. It was that silly, really.
Okay, yeah, that's a deep cut right there. But, well, this is good to talk about, just how silly it is that you go to the Carolinas. That is a ridiculously far overland journey in the 1600s. There's not even a colony there at that time, is there?
Well, that's the interesting part. Just a little of the history of the Carolina colony to show how silly that is. The Carolina colony was originally chartered as basically the land of North Carolina, a little bit of Tennessee, and South Carolina. That was chartered in the 1820s, but for a couple of different reasons, it was only chartered on paper. Nobody had actually set up an establishment there. There had been a couple of, failure to start colonies and settlements there, but nothing really. The first really permanent colony there was actually something the Spanish had set up. So they certainly weren't going to go to a Spanish colony that had basically gone defunct about close to 3/4 of a century before the time of this movie. Then after that, the first permanent settlement was more just a few miles away from modern day Charleston, South Carolina. And that colony was basically on the verge of failure for several decades until it established itself. So that was not a place where you were necessarily going to go to start a new life. And I believe, I'm not 100% sure of this, the people who had moved to Charleston, who set up, well, it was called Charlestown, were from Bermuda, and they had failed at farming in Bermuda, and that was kind of their last hope, was setting up in Charlestown. So that's not necessarily the place where you're going to be smiling to go to as your next stop after you've gotten kicked out of Boston and Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Yeah, I mean, this gets into geography of time and place of 17th century America. It's so stupid that they could have chosen anything if they're going to make up a new ending. And South Carolina, like you said, no one lives there. To go overland is so dangerous. You're encountering multiple Indian tribes. Many of them may not be friendly because they've had poor dealings with other European colonists. That's like a Lewis and Clark expedition with a woman who's pregnant. When you could have had so many other choices at hand, really, you could go a few villages away in New England. Theoretically, if our Dimsdale is a high-profile enough figure, maybe his reputation would follow him. I guess take a ship down to the Virginia colonies with the tobacco plantations, go all the way to the Caribbean. Those are much more built up in the 17th century. But, I mean, just like geographical scope, I mean, maybe today you have to, if you do something to cause a scandal in your town, you have to go to another state. To get a sense of how different geography is before steamships and railroads, when you could reliably travel hundreds of miles in a day, I read a number of travel logs when I was doing some different historical research in, I think it was the 18th century, and you're limited vastly. If you're on foot, it's 10, 15 miles a day. 20 miles is like a forced march of a soldier. If you're on a horse, it's a little faster, but then after 30 miles, you're very uncomfortable riding that long. All that to say, your scope completely changes, and 10, 20 miles away, you could be completely unknown in a village or a setting you're in, so you do not have to go very far at all. Before the age of newspapers, especially, before people really have much comings and goings with one another, it's when we just think of Puritan society as being omnipresent and this panopticon that sees everything you do and you're judged. In a very tightly knit, close community, that can happen. But if that wasn't for you, it's very simple just to move into the woods and get away from it. Boom, taken care of. You don't have to go to another state. So just a little bit of a geographic segue. But I don't want to steal your thunder, Steve, because there's so much else to talk about what's bad with this movie.
Just so much bad. So much bad. I think, like we've been just saying, this movie does not stand the test of time. It's very dated. I think getting into our next phase, if we can, to just get out of we got to crawl out of the negativity here. What would you do to make this movie a better movie?
Like, from a historical standpoint, as film, it doesn't work if you're going to have someone with completely modern sensibilities, you can't try to have someone who's going to upend puritanical society with 21st century gender politics, because that's too far out there to make it work. I mean, you could have keep the theme of not undue punishment on someone, where social pressure causes undue punishment that exceeds what is justified by the crime. Because I can't even say radical individuality, because that doesn't even make much sense in this context. So, I mean, other than like stick things pretty close to the novel, then not change the novel. I mean, it just didn't work. Oh, I guess I would say this. One way that you could conceivably make this better, Robert Duvall, they do incorporate Native American society into this, and I guess the Algonquins sort of come off positively, because it's thanks to them that Hester is able to escape, because, a flaming arrow shoots her down. And as we both know, I mean, if an arrow is shot, it's always flaming.
Yeah.
That always makes sense in 100% of the context, because, I mean, it's easy to light one. The flame always does something that just a regular arrow wouldn't do.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense to stop in combat to light an arrow rather than fire them as quickly as possible. So the Algonquins sort of come off okay in this, because what's his name gets kicked out. Roger gets kicked out of the tribe for being too crazy. If you want to get into the intercultural element and kind of veer off the original source text, a big part of colonial life is that there were always people going off to join tribes. People would leave New England tribal life and they would go join the American Indians. The reverse almost never happened. You would never have an American Indian who'd say, you know what, I'm tired of hunting. I want to be adopted by a New England family and go till the soil. This is a big theme in a recent book called Sebastian Junger, called Tribes, where he talks about, with our isolation we feel in the 21st century, what are positive things we can see in the past of tribal life where people seem somewhat content? And his point being that throughout colonial life, from the first encounters with the Pilgrims or Plymouth Colony and Roanoke up to the ends of tribal life in the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, you had white people running off and joining the tribes, and they could marry in. They would be accepted in the tribe. They wouldn't be considered inferior for being white. And if you're going to follow a theme of a subversion of the social order that this movie wants to do and really go off the rails, then have the two of them run off and join an Indian tribe. That would Dimsdale and Hester Prynne. That's completely out of the source text, but if they want to abandon the message of the original and make it about radical individuality, tying in them joining an American Indian tribe where they're doing something radically different from their original life, that would be one way to do that in the 17th century if you're going to do it in any way possible. Not just the two of them create their own little, I don't know, free love civilization in South Carolina, whatever they're going to say. So that's one way I could see it making work, but then it just gets even more ridiculous, where at the end goes with like Gary Oldman and Demi Moore wearing bear skins and, or, actually maybe if the movie got even more ridiculous and leaned into its ridiculousness, then it gets into the realm of pure camp. And I like pure camp. So yeah, I think that's what would make it better. They join an Indian tribe. It allows you to historically accurately subvert a social order if you choose to do so. And it's funny in a ridiculous way. There you go.
I think the way I would make it better is during the publicity phase of the movie, Demi Moore said something to the effect that the novel by Nathaniel Hawthorne just doesn't make good film, and so that's why they had to really radically change it. So there was a mini series done by Masterpiece Theater that was Demi Moore said that the book would be better translated as a mini series, and there was a mini series done on Masterpiece Theater from PBS that in 1979 that was about 4 hours long. That was really the book acted out, and it was, I mean, that was like one of the ones, if you read that book probably in the 80s or the 90s or probably even to the 2000s, your English teacher would shuffle over and pull the VHS out of there in high school and play that miniseries. I guarantee it, your English teacher wasn't going to pull out the VHS of the 1995 Scarlet Letter with Demi Moore.
Yeah, that would be the edited made-for-TV version, definitely. And then it's...
then forget about it. I think that to make this a better movie, you don't have to strictly go by the novel, but making a period piece about the Puritans and how the Puritans reacted to different social things that were going on and their conflicts with the Native Americans and the founding of the Massachusetts Bay and the Plymouth colonies, that would be a pretty interesting movie that I think you could make today and that people would watch. But this, this, I hate to say, but this garbage of this movie with Demi Moore, just surface level themes, throwaway lines, a little skin, and I just don't know who they made this movie for.
Yeah, this shares a lot in common with our John Wayne movie, The Conqueror, where the problem is we're thinking about this logically. You have to see the eyes of a Hollywood producer where, hey, I can attach a star to this. I can get funding, even if the idea is completely stupid. That's how money works and deals work. But to follow up on your idea about Puritan society, I think that there is something that could be done historically. Puritans they're not depicted accurately in fiction. I think some of the reason is we have the major works of American literature like the Scarlet Letter or the Crucible in the 1950s. The Puritans aren't looked at for historical reasons, but they're looked as an allegory of some of the problems in the American psyche that were there at the beginning and we're still wrestling with them today. So as a vehicle for allegory, they work beautifully. But actually looking into Puritan society, it's not as simple as they wear pilgrim garb and they're all listening to Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God and giving each other the skunk eye over predeterminism and Calvinism and who's the elect that will go to heaven and everyone else is hellbound. Yeah, that's definitely there, but the religiosity, it might not be any worse than what you would see in England in different places. Maybe you have a little bit more faithful adherence. I did an episode on my podcast a while ago about the Salem witch trials, and there's a lot of scholarship about it, but some of the main points is that, was it religiosity that got out of hand? I mean, absolutely. There's no question, and the language that was used to describe it and demonic possession was a part of it. But to understand the origin of it, a lot of it had to do with politics and a governor of the Plymouth colony that completely got out of hand. So it's sort of a cautionary tale of local politics. And there's lots and lots of other mitigating factors. I won't get into it now. And when you look at the early pilgrims around the time of Plymouth Rock and the first Thanksgiving and other things, the pilgrims are interesting because they're actually minor players in tribal warfare and politics that are going on. And their translator, we call him Squanto or Esquanto, who was taken captive. He was in England for a number of years, and that's how he was able to learn English. He and some others are using the pilgrims as pawns in this Game of Thrones-esque diplomatic game that's going on with the American Indians there and tribal issues, and they're seen as useful, so that's why they're not wiped out. Smallpox also helps out, too, for wiping out the Indians there, unfortunately. But there's this whole game of politics going on that they barely understand, the pilgrims, I mean, of which they're barely a pawn. And there's constant dealings with American Indians. Is there bigotry and warfare happening? Yes. Is there also trade happening? And they're trying to understand as these aliens and pioneers in a strange land? Yes. So there's to think of them as sort of like these, I don't know, like these Cossacks on the Russian frontier in a way, much more hardier and tougher. They're not just sitting around in their hats with their buckles on the front with pure white linens. Life was rough. You're directly on the frontier. It was dirtier and grimier than we would think of. So actually doing the Puritans right in history, I can't really think of something that's accurate. And I think the reason why it would be so hard to do is because we associate the Puritans with literary motifs like the Crucible or the Scarlet Letter that are so hard to overcome. It would take something to turn the dial that would be very difficult to do. So I would be curious in that story of a retelling of, the Pilgrims arriving, but from the vantage point of the Indians. But it's not even so much about the Indians. It's this tribal politics game going on of which they are a small part. So that's my idea.
Yeah, a small part that they don't really understand. Everybody has their own motives and their own desires. That would be a lot more interesting than what we normally get. But I think, like you said, there's an expectation of the Puritans are a certain way, the Pilgrims are a certain way, and it would be very difficult to get people out of that mind frame.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I can't think of anything else for the Scarlet Letter. Do you recommend people watch it, Steve, just out of comedy, or what do you think?
I think that this one could be one if you wanted to have a couple of drinks on a Saturday night and just have a really good laugh. I bet you this one might even have a riff tracks to it, where the guys from Mystery Science Theater 3000 make fun of the movie throughout the... Have you heard of those?
I love those. Yeah, I can't recommend those highly enough. The funniest one is on Twilight.
Oh, man.
It rips us to shreds. But the Vin Diesel movie, Triple X, that's also really good. Point Break, that's a great one. Absolutely great series. What would be a drinking game, and what would you have to drink?
Probably with the these and the thous and just like the faux Puritan stuff that they do. That's really, it's not quite Puritan. I don't know if it's Shakespearean, like what they're exactly going for, but that was pretty bad.
Yeah, depending on how hammered you want to get. Every time Demi Moore's accent is horrible, take a drink. Every time there's a gratuitous, sensual, soft lighting body shot, take a drink. What would you drink? I mean, Puritans aren't known for their drink, but the English were swimming in gin at this point in the 17th century. So what did Native Americans drink?
I don't know if the Northeastern had a alcoholic beverage or not.
Yeah, a lot of the problems a lot of it had to do with trade later on. Maybe if I had... Not really sure about that. I mean, humanity's really resourceful at finding fermentables and make things to drink, even if it's not great. We talked about horse milk with the Mongols and fermenting it. So I
think like the ones further in the South, like the Incans had like a fermented corn beverage, pulque or something like that.
Pulque, yeah. When I was down in Mexico, I tracked down some of that. It was a ceremonial drink of the Aztecs. It tastes kind of meat. It's like milk, but it tastes beany and meaty. If that really sounds good to you, then pulque, but that's getting, very far south with a very different indigenous culture. So I don't know. I mean, for the time period of this, if there were kind of a naughty Puritan who liked to take a nip of the drink from back in England, it'd be gin.
Yeah.
Can't really...
Watered down rum or something.
I don't know what you drink at Thanksgiving time, since that's associated with Pilgrims and Puritans. It's kind of spiked punch. So there you go, everyone. This is our first drinking game that we have with an episode, and it was on the Scarlet Letter of all things.
And if you have some ideas for movies, definitely let us know. And we'll probably wind up having some polls on these movies to see if somebody really loves them out there. I want to meet the person who really loved this movie.
Yeah, that's... I'll have to look for a positive review if it exists on the internet.
And we'll talk to you next time.